Divine Set 1 has brought us a lot of interesting new decks, but also has given some support to some older ones, and the one I've really been enjoying playtesting has been Magnolia. The new support style has been geared more towards Magnolia Elder, but technically can work with any Magnolia build, just Elder brings out the full potential of it. So first I wanted to go over the new cards that this set gave us that I'm running in this list. First off, the two commons are two new Ride Line cards. We have Blossoming Sylvan Horn Beast Icirrus, as well as Mercy Sylvan Horn Beast Lattice. So Icirrus here, now when rode upon by grade 2 a Sylvan Horn Beast in its card name, lets you look at the top 3 cards of your deck, choose up to one grade 2 or less normal unit from among them, call it to rearguard circle, and you may discard the rest. If you did not discard any cards, put the cards not chosen on the bottom of your deck in any order. Lattice, on the other hand, when it's rode upon by a grade 3 card with Magnolia in its card name, lets you Soul Blast one to choose a grade 3 or greater card from your drop or a normal order from your drop and put it into your hand. And then on rearguard circle continuous during your turn, if you have a grade 3 or greater Vanguard with Magnolia in its card name, it gets power plus 5,000. So these are just strict upgrades to their older versions and much deserved. I always felt like the OG Icirrus and Lattice really did leave a lot to be desired when compared to other Ride Line cards, hence why in pretty much all my Magnolia builds since the deck first came out, I've been running Rancor Chain and Black Tears Husk Dragon. But these cards actually feel a lot better for Magnolia than I think those two are, especially this Lattice over the Black Tears Husk Dragon. So things I like about these cards are, one, they're not locked into the specific Lattice and Magnolia. These are just any Magnolia, any Sylvan Horn Beast grade 2, which gives you a lot more versatility in what you can run your Ride Line, and I really appreciate that. While this deck doesn't really take advantage of that fact, I'm happy that it is an option. And this one, Icirrus, just be able to look at top 3 to call a card, lets you get cards to board, search out your pieces, and I really like that option to either discard or put to the bottom of the deck, because there are definitely times where I just see a card I can call and then a bunch of pieces that I can easily recur from my drop, and I can just send them that way, and if not, I can always choose to put them on the bottom of the deck. As for the Lattice, I really like this effect because one, it's super flexible, and two, it lets me discard grade 3 and grade 4 pieces such as the Magnolia Elder earlier. Since I don't need it for a bit, I can prioritize keeping other cards in hand and not having to, if I discard a Magnolia Elder, hope I can draw into it later. Instead, I can safely discard it and just loop it back with the Lattice. And the 5k, that's so-so, but it is nice since sometimes you will call it out. So all in all, I think these are two very solid options and amazing for this deck. The other two support cards from the set that I'm running are the Sylvan Horn Beast Banaspati as well as the Sea Rumble Brave Shooter. So Banaspati is a grade 2 that when placed on rearguard circle other than during the battle phase lets you counterblast 1 and soul blast 1 to choose one of your vanguards with Sylvan Horn Beast in its card name, and for every 2 grades of that unit, choose a grade 3 or less card with a different card name from this unit from your drop and call it to rearguard circle. And then when this unit attacks, you get to choose one of your vanguards with Sylvan Horn Beast in its card name. For every 2 grades of that unit, this unit gets power plus 5,000 until end of that battle. As for Sea Rumble Brave Shooter, only the first effect matters because the second effect is Persona Ride locked, and this deck doesn't run Persona Ride, but when it's put on guard circle from hand or discard from hand while you're riding from your ride deck, you can counterblast 1 or Energy Blast 3 to draw a card. So this one's a bit easier to talk about. Simply put, it's just a great way to cycle through your deck, get some early game draw, but it's also super flexible as you can still call to guard and circle to guard with it in the late game. And that versatility really comes in handy. And I feel like this deck really takes good advantage of that versatility in the cost of Counterblast 1 or Energy Blast 3, because this deck doesn't really counterblast too much, meaning that counterblast is easily accessible for this Brave Shooter here, meaning I can also stock up energy to sometimes just Energy Blast 7 to draw 1, just get even more value, which is great, just efficiently using my resources. Though definitely have to be careful not to get counterblast denied. As for the Banaspati, this is the big one to talk about here. Had to get this one in FFR, of course. So this effect, there are, obviously the high roll is the first thing that comes to mind. You just get to choose your Vanguard, and if you're on Elder, you get to call 2 cards. That is a +2 in card advantage to board. That is massive, easily recurring your pieces from your drop. Just, it's great for this deck because you love being, well, you can easily cycle stuff into your drop. It doesn't matter if your opponent tries to get rid of it, you can easily rebuild your board, which is crucial for the 6 attacks. And on top of that, because Elder lets you just intercept from the back row, you can also just intercept away your pieces, knowing that you can recur them with Banaspati to get out even more shield value in your deck. The second thing that took me a bit more time to notice about this card is, even though it does check your Vanguard's grade, it is not actually locked behind grade 3 or even grade 4 or greater. It's just locked behind your Vanguard being Sylvan Horn Beast. So you can call this down on turn 2 and immediately start calling cards from your drop to quickly build up board and rush your opponent. And same with that power skill. It can, from grade 2 onwards, immediately attack for 15k. I mean, you also can use this as a very aggressive tool, which I really like, without really committing much more to your from your hand. You just have to commit the resources, of course. And the other neat thing about this aggression is its effect to call grade 3 or greater cards. It only checks your Vanguard's grade to see how many cards you can call. It does not check the Vanguard's grade for what units you can call. So if you discard a grade 3 early on, you can actually call that back on turn 2. It's not super relevant in terms of effects for this deck, but what it is relevant for is if you go first and your opponent's still on their 8k grade 1 Vanguard and you call a 13k base, that's already demanding a 10k shield. So it still gets blocked by a defensive trigger, but it also is still applying more pressure and your opponent's more likely to take it, which is amazing. This card is very, very good. As for the game plan of this deck can really just call down whatever in the early game to aggress the opponent. The goal is just to put on some aggression. Of course, we got the bonus body for some nice aggressive plays. But once we hit turn 3, we are not actually trying to accelerate up into the Magnolia Elder. So instead, on grade 3 Magnolia, we want to try to find some inlet pulses as well as a Goyledote. That way, we're putting on some pressure, but at the end of turn, we can start drawing some cards to help stabilize in the early game, or into the mid game by getting a ton of card draw. Then go into, of course, our Elder on turn 4, being able to recur some resources like the Goyledote or even an Inlet Pulse. And then from there, we can make the choice of either trying to farm cards up by recalling the Inlet Pulses to be able to generate more card advantage, of course, using bonus bite to help build the board. But once we're kind of done with that and ready to go for the kill, we just want to try to find as many Alpens as there are our biggest attacker to beat down the opponent. Getting into list itself, for the Ride deck, we've got the grade 0 Lot, grade 1 the new Karis, grade 2 the new Lattice, and grade 3 our Sylvanhorn Beast King Magnolia. So this star can be whatever you want it to be. I just want to be thematic and run my SP Lot. As for the grade 1 and grade 2, there are options here, but I definitely prefer the Karis and the Lattice. I mentioned this earlier, but Karis just letting you check top 3 just lets you dig deeper into your deck for your pieces, lets you be more aggressive, and also gives you the option if you just find a ton of gas, since we can easily return it from the underworld, we can just send it there, and if not, if it's triggers, just send it to the bottom of the deck and we can easily shuffle it with some of our other cards. The Lattice is really nice, giving us flexibility to discard our grade 4 and grade 3 pieces early on and recur them, or even our normal orders. Just great utility overall, and then we have to run this Magnolia or else the deck doesn't work. It's our only option here. Getting into the main deck, of course, 4 copies of our Magnolia Elder. This is pretty much our main enabler for our game plan of this deck, just giving us 6 attacks by having a Magnolia in Soul or Rearguard Circle. And then, of course, just lets us spawn a card from Soul when it's placed, and giving our Rearguards 5k power and the ability to intercept from the back row. It just does a lot to enable this deck's game plan. The main one being, of course, those 6 attacks. The Triple Drive is also very nice pressure overall. Since this is our main, we want to find this, we have to hard draw into it. Definitely maxing this card out because absolutely need to find it. And also, it's not bad to have later in the game, as placing it gives us a lot of utility to recur back some of our pieces, such as Inlet Pulses or Goyledotes. For the grade 3s, I run 3 copies of Inlet Pulse Dragon, as well as 3 copies of the Enlargolv. So set 13 card I haven't really talked about too much. I'll start with the Inlet Pulse because this one's a bit easier to talk about. This has been in the list for forever. Simply put, it's for that second effect that at the end of your turn, if you attacked a number 4 or more times that turn, you can put it to Soul to draw a card. Just a great way to just draw and cycle resources as well, giving you more Soul for your other effects. Frankly, this card is definitely past its prime. It's probably the weakest card of the deck and the card I want to cut the most. However, there's no card that really can replace what it does. And what it does is very important for this deck's game plan. Thus, it is still run only at 3 copies. I found 4 copies. I was just bricking on them, finding them in drive checks and running out shield value. 3 copies felt like the sweet spot where I can still find it to be able to use that effect, draw into my pieces, but also just not get too many of them and get a clumped hand with no shield value. As for the Enlargolv, this one is amazing for the deck. Very strong card. So when it's placed on Rearguard Circle or put on Guardian Circle, you choose one grade 4 card from your hand, reveal it. If you revealed a card or your Vanguard's grade 4, perform one of the following according to the circle this unit is on. On Rearguard Circle, you can Soul Blast one, choose a grade 2 or greater card with a different card name from this unit from your drop and put it to your hand. And if it's put on Guardian Circle, it gets shield plus 15k until end of that battle. And of course, the second effect is when it's discarded from hand, while running a grade 3 or a grade 3 from your right deck or paying the cost to stride, you draw a card. So both effects are live here. Like Magnolia is probably the perfect deck to utilize this card, as all the effects are live here. The draw when discarding up for grade 3 is just nice, some extra draw power. The 15k shield just gives this deck extra shield value, which honestly, when I first was testing this deck, I completely forgot about this card and it was lacking shield value, and this fixed it right up. And the place on rearguard effect, probably the effect I use the least. Still really great utility, being able to loop back other stuff. Maybe it's an inlet pulse to get even more draw. Maybe it's my kill turn and I just want to recur an extra Alpin from my drop to be able to round out board because I had this in hand and didn't need it. Just really strong effect, really great utility for the effect. I would definitely run a 4th copy of this card, but in testing, I was finding that a lot of times I would just have like an Enlargolv in hand that really wasn't doing much even into the late game. So sure, a lot of times I use that just circle back and Alpin, but I figured there's another card that I want to run at 4 copies that I was saying was my 51st card in my deck, and then I was saying to myself, well, I just have this thing in hand, why don't I just replace that with literally the card I want to run the 51st copy of, especially if that would just be recurring anyway. So hence why it's a 3 split here, and 3-3 on these. Feels great, especially since these are grade 3, so they also don't have shield value until, well, this one at least doesn't have shield value until you're on grade 4 as well. So these ratios felt correct to me. Moving on to the grade 2s, I'm going to break this up a little bit. First off, 4 copies of the Sea Rumble Brave Shooter. This card's just great to cycle into even more cards, both early and late game. Just let me dig deeper into the deck. It's a great 5k shield and a great discard for a ride deck. It just really helps this card with even more card draw, which it does need. I kind of went over this already in the beginning of the video, so 4 copies has just felt right to be able to make sure I see them as consistently as possible. Do note with this card that you have to call it from hand to Guardian Circle, so you can't call it out and intercept it to get to draws. Doesn't work like that. Now, as for the Sylvanhorn Beast I'm running 4 copies of Alpin, 4 copies of Bonus Body, and the 3 Goyle Dote, which don't quite fit into frame here. Let me zoom out. There we go. So 3 Goyle Dote. So these are Sylvanhorn Beast grade 2s. They really just facilitate everything that this deck really is trying to accomplish here. So 4 copies of Alpin, as is our biggest beater, being able to gain plus 15k. So on an elder turn, it is swinging for 30k. So they're going to need a 20k guard to 1 card guarded and can hit over 1 defensive trigger. This was when I originally was running at 3 copies because I really didn't need it till the late game, as it doesn't work until I'm on a Magnolia. But at the same time, I mentioned with the Enlargolv that I was running into, I had like an extra Enlargolv I wasn't using in hand a lot of my games. So I was just like, wait, I keep saying I want to run a 4th copy of Alpin to make sure I maximize my chances on finding as many of these to beat down my opponent. Why not just run the 4th copy? So that's what I ended up doing. The resource effect doesn't really come up because this isn't a super resource intensive deck. Usually has the exact number of resource it wants without any need to recur them through other effects. 4 copies of the Bonus Body because this is a great early game aggro tool and is just the most effective way to refill a board in the late game. So I want to keep finding them turn after turn, thus 4 copies. And then 3 copies of the Goyle Dote. I only really need 1, maybe 2 copies. Most of the time, only 1 to start getting that card draw. It's also nice because it does gain the 10k power, so it is a 25k beater behind in the back row and behind the Vanguard circle, mainly to get that card draw. And it's also nice to give the Magnolias an extra 5k power by throwing it into the Soul. It also does enable me to be able to loop with Magnolia Elder being the main one I loop for powerful attack and card draw as well. Definitely doesn't feel as good as it once was, but that's also the reason why I'm running only 3 copies, because I don't really want to clog up my board with Goyle Dotes, since I can't really cycle them. I'd rather save those spaces for stuff like Alpins, and Bonus Spy does hit the same number. So only 3 copies. I don't always find it. Like, ideally I want to find it on my grade 3 turn, but at the same time, once I find one, as I said, I don't really need any other ones. So if I find it, awesome. If I don't, it's fine. So 3 copies felt right, and it also means I have deck space for other stuff. The only grade 1 unit cards for the deck I'm running are 4 PGs. Don't have the new Elementaria Sanctitude. Definitely going to be sliding that in for one of these, but just 4 effect PGs. These should be pretty self-explanatory. This deck doesn't do anything special where I wouldn't need the 4 copies or want the 4 copies. I'm going to go over the orders before I move on to the triggers. So for the orders, I do run 1 4-bit-all surrogate. This card is just great being a grade 4 deck, as well as a deck that runs 2 different grade 3s. Just super flexible in what I can do in this, and it's just a huge spike in my game plan, thanking the deck of 2 cards as well. So pretty much just helps me find my Elder if I need it. It helps me just call out inlet pulses. They can even call out an Alargolf, which is probably the least likely use case I do, because most of the time it's like, all right, I'm calling on a Largolf, I'm looping something back to hand, or I could just add an Elder to hand and keep in a Largolf in my deck, which I can drive check into or draw into for that 15k shield. But it's still a possibility if the play is for relevant, just really strong card for this deck. And then I also run 4 Mythiarch Habitat. This is just such a phenomenal consistency tool card. Being able to look at the top 7 to call a card of grade less than or equal to my Vanguard to Rearguard circle. So really, I don't play this on turn 1 because that would just be calling triggers or PGs, which I don't want. But turn 2 onwards, this card's great. It just helps me thin my deck out, find my pieces, and again, just getting them to board. Even if they get removed, I've got Bonaspide to recur them, so it's fine. And I also really like using this card in the late game to dig. Maybe I'll find a Bonaspide so I can keep a Bonaspide in hand for a later turn. And I always have the option when I play this card to just add this card, like another copy to hand, thin out the deck by 1. This deck really doesn't have too much issue filling up the board, so that's also a super viable play. And just means that it, again, deck thinning, and also that's one less card I'm just going to draw into with no shield value. So I was playing this at 3 copies, but I really like the consistency that 4 copies brings to my deck. And also there's other ways to bring this out, like the Karis should work with this card. Yeah, it works with the Karis as well. So you can add it off of Karis to then dig even deeper into the deck. Just phenomenal consistency. This is why you see this definitely in a bunch of I shouldn't say a bunch, but why this is such a common place in Stoicheia decks if they want to run orders. Finally, wrapping up with the triggers, I do run the 8 crits, 3 fronts, 4 heals, and then the Bless Favor OT. So the reason I opted for 8 crits, frankly, this deck lacks power. It's very much a slow burn deck. I was trying out fronts, but what I found was the crits are just better. They're more explosive. In the early game, pushing up to higher damage, meaning my opponent can take less damage later in the game to hope for defensive triggers to shut down my attacks. And in the late game, it just puts even more pressure behind my Magnolia Elder. And what I really like to do is, a lot of times, I don't give the crit to Vanguard if I check it. Unless it would be threaten a lethal swing and my opponent no-guarded it, or just some scenario where it break through. Most of the time, I actually give the power to rear guards, for the sole reason of it gives my opponent less defensive triggers to shut down my attacks, because my attacks aren't really hitting greater than 30k without triggers. Most of the time they're hitting more like 25k, and even 18k for my Inlet Pulses. So, but by giving them to a rear guard circle, or one of my rear guards, they then can threaten lethal, or I can attack with my 1 crit stuff to try to get the crit pressure card to a lethal, and then my opponent has to guard that. So they're at less power because less defensive triggers checked, and they have to guard these swings. So that I just found to be the most optimal. 3 fronts. This deck doesn't need any more draws. It's got plenty of draws. I don't think draws are necessarily wrong either, but when I was thinking about it, I do value the extra power more. It also helps me break through guard a bit easier, makes my opponent a bit wary to even 2 to pass my Magnolia Elder Swing, because if I hit a front first, then I can safely give another trigger power to it, because I don't even have the choice there. So I value that a bit more than the draws. 4 heals, pretty standard. Oh, and then as for why I don't run the effect crits, I just don't need the soul. I'd rather the 5k power, so at least I can make good numbers when boosting with my stuff. Not super relevant, but can sometimes be relevant. And finally, the Blessed Favor. Plenty of other options for OT here that I think are fine. I just value that this is a 4th front and a 9th crit first and foremost, and specifically that combination of the 2. Just also an Omni trigger is seldomly bad. Blue OT also would work, but I didn't feel like I needed to recur a piece. Again, just the Omni trigger I feel like is better, drawing deeper into my deck anyway. I can get in my drop plenty fine. And then the Valnaught, I think it's alright, but I do think it's just a bit worse than this because it is another restand, but I'd rather just, again, get the 9th crit, 4th front. Oh, and don't want to forget, I just run the 5k heals because my locals doesn't have leaning one way or another towards crit pressure or restanding, so I just kind of kept them generic. But the more I've played, the more I feel like this deck really struggles against multi-attack decks, not necessarily crit pressure deck, but specifically multi-attack decks. So I would say that the smart play would be to swap out 2 of these heals for the 25k shield if a unit has restood. But at the same time, definitely look at your local to see what kind of multi-attack they're running, because, you know, when we're facing off against stuff like Rezael, which just recalls stuff, those cards aren't very good either. But stuff like Varga, that's when that kind of heal is very good. So I haven't pulled the plug on that yet, but that's something I've been kind of paying attention to and seeing when I want to pull the plug on that and test it out. For the mulligan, first and foremost, you just want to find your Magnolia Elder. This deck doesn't do anything if you don't find your Magnolia Elder to ride on turn 4. From there, you can kind of pretty much keep any of your unit cards, as they're all very useful at different stages of the game. Really just sending back those triggers is optimal. And for PGs, it's matchup dependent whether you keep them or throw them back. As for other options that I've considered for this deck, I've got the new support card Sylvanhorn Beast Ilkwyn, and going along with it, the Wild Intelligence. So this is a double rare from the set. When it's placed on Rearguard Circle, if you have a grade 3 or greater Vanguard with Magnolia in its card name, you can Soul Blast 1, discard a card to search your deck, or drop for up to 1 card with Magnolia in its different card name from your Vanguard, or up to 1 grade 0 normal order, reveal it, put your hand, and if you search your deck, shuffle it. So it's extra consistency for the deck, being able to pinpoint search the Magnolia Elder, or Wild Intelligence here is the most, the clear choice for the grade 0 order as well. But other than that, this card's very underpowered. Like, I hated having it on board because it doesn't do anything. And since Magnolia Elder, it benefits to find extra copies of this for what I said, I don't really feel the need to pinpoint search it. I can easily just find it and draw into it. I have not had an issue with that whatsoever to justify a consistency card like this that really doesn't do anything else. And then as for Wild Intelligence, I also didn't value really searching this card out. The cost is whatever, but forcing to mill the 3 meant I was milling triggers and PGs, which I prefer to keep in deck. I just feel like there are so many better ways to load up your drop with the pieces you need and better consistency cards for the deck. So when I don't want to run this and I don't feel like I need this to find my Magnolia, the easiest solution is just to cut these. But there are definitely options if you want to mess around with it, and maybe you'll see something that I didn't, and hopefully, specifically for the Ilkwyn, I really love that grade 0 search. I hope we get more grade 0 orders for Magnolia, and in general in the future, to hopefully give this card a bit more viability. Another option I was originally testing with that I decided to cut was the Friendship Fairy here. Just a nice way to accelerate into the Magnolia Elder if you go second. Frankly, how I was playing the deck, I didn't feel the need I needed to. Most of the time when I was doing this Friendship Fairy play, it was just minusing so much in card advantage that I felt like I just lost on that. Then instead of just staying on the grade 3 Magnolia, farming up a hand, waiting until turn 4, that just felt better to me. And then this is a dead card going first. So ultimately, I decided to cut it, but you can definitely try this one out. And I think this might be a bit better for a more aggressive build of Magnolia Elder that values getting to that Magnolia Elder ASAP for some aggression. Speaking of aggression, one aggressive tool that I think could go in very well, probably over the Inlet Pulse Dragon, is the Winsipu here from set 9. So 2 effects, deck or hand. If you have a grade 2 or greater Vanguard with Sylvanhorn Beast in its card name that's different from this card, it gets grade -1. And then on Rearguard Circle, if you have a Magnolia Vanguard that was placed this turn, it gets 10k power. So it's just a 23k beater. Under Magnolia Elder, it's 28k. That is numbers comparable to the Alpin. And it's just an extra big beater to kind of round off your board. Again, I didn't run this because it's got no shield value, and I felt like I was trying to go for a slower game plan that gives me more time to find my Alpins, which I think are just better overall. But even just calling this down turn 2, it definitely is a strong, aggressive card, but I can't justify it with how I'm trying to play the deck. But maybe if you're playing a more aggressive deck, this will slot in nicely. Another one is the In Search of a Faraway Ideal. I was running this at a 1-of for a bit in place of one of the Mythiarch Habitats, just to kind of give myself some extra oomph in the late game, just being able to choose my units and give it 5k for each other unit that attacked, meaning it gets pumped up by 25k, making it a massive swing. Frankly, I just found it, well, I only got it off once and it didn't matter, and the reason I decided to cut it ultimately was because I just missed seeing that 4th Mythiarch Habitat. I visibly noticed in the games I was testing this that I really wasn't resolving Mythiarch Habitat all too much or really finding it. So I just value that consistency more than this big late game push. But I definitely think it's still a neat idea if it lines up, and at worst you can just discard it for a PG anyway. Again, I just couldn't find deck space, as simple as that. Moving away from more aggressive options to more utility options, In the Dim Darkness and Spiritual Body Condensation are good choices, specifically if you want to have a way to retrieve bonus body from your drop to then be able to trigger its effect. And really, In the Dim Darkness helps you thin your deck if you value that, or you can go Spiritual Body Condensation for the extra 5k just to help your, really whatever you call, hit even bigger numbers. If it is the bonus body, it will be hitting 30k, which is comparable to Alpin, which is very nice. Just depends on which one you're valuing, but I didn't really have a difficulty being able to find my bonus bodies, so I didn't feel like these were necessary. I'd rather just run the Mythiarch Habitat. I felt like that was a bit stronger at all stages in the game, while these would definitely be more, well, they do have utility in the early game. I felt If I'm just wanting to recur the Bonispati for late game, and that's not an issue, why run these? Mythiarch, I think, is just better. And then finally, if you want to try to protect your pieces from stuff like Shiranui, we got the M-Picks here. So of course, good old Ben picks from back row gains 10k, so it's a 23k attacker under Elder. And if you have 3 or less rear guards, all your rear guards the same cost as you cannot be chosen by your opponent's card effect. So it's just a great way so that you don't have to clear your entire board, because you really want your board intact to attack with, but you don't have to try to clear it when facing Shiranui to dodge at least its first stride. Instead, if you can just get an M-Picks and sink your other 3 rear guards into the soul or off the board really, then you can just shut down that first stride turn. Frankly, this deck isn't being Shiranui, so I didn't feel like it was worthwhile running the M-Picks. I don't think the M-Picks changes that. I think it just delays the inevitable, which I'll get into in this final section here after this. So I ultimately decided not to run it. I don't know what I really want to run over. I feel like everything else is more crucial, more powerful, but it is an option if you want a tech card against Shiranui to try to find some space for it. So my closing thoughts on this deck are, it's a really fun deck. Bonispati's very powerful. The new ride line is much appreciated, but this deck can't compete with the meta right now. All the meta decks just do different aspects of what Elder does, but better. And on top of that, I feel like their overall card quality is just better as well. Notably, Magnolia here is just very weak compared to the new grade 3s that are out right now. So having to always have at least one turn with it just feels really not that great. Like, deck's just doing way more on grade 3, and even with the Friendship Fairy, I don't think it resolves that issue. So I think this deck is very much due for an upgraded grade 3 for the deck. Elder also is feeling less like an insane card like it was when it was released in set 4, and more just kind of a, I don't want to say fair, but a little above average. 6 attacks is really strong, especially for no cost, but it's the weakest form of multi-attack in that you're not boosting with them because you're attacking with all your units. So the power output of this deck also just feels like it's very lacking, easily shut down by defensive triggers, or even just 2 defensive triggers typically shuts this deck completely down, forcing it to rely on triggers. Though I will say, I don't think that Magnolia Elder necessarily needs to be replaced. We really just need to replace this Magnolia here and probably just get a few other better cards, just higher quality cards, support cards, to help bolster out the power. Like, I remember it was a big deal if you got 5k just to, obviously this deck needed 5k just to be able to hit over the 13k grade 3 base. I know it was big once the deck started getting 10k power buffs to be able to hit over 1 defensive trigger. And now the power scaling in the current era, specifically because this deck doesn't really boost, it really feels like it needs to be hitting that 15k that Alpin does, or even plus 20k to start doing anything. So hopefully we'll see more support here. But one thing I am looking forward to testing once we get Festival Booster is a more aggressive version of this deck. I feel like the aggressive cards right now just are very weak, so, and it didn't interest me as much. But one thing that might help this deck is if it's a bit more aggressive, pushing them to higher damage, so the Magnolia Elder swing is a bit more threatening because they're at higher damage, could really help it out. And just, there's so many great aggressive tools coming out in Festival Booster to support that. And I guess the final thought there was kind of tying it all together. The reason I went for this more slower beatdown variant was it just looked more interesting. It was the more classic Magnolia Elder build, so it looked the most fun to me, and Bonispati, I felt like it really did support it. And the high rolls, of course, is fun, but it definitely is feeling very much outpaced. Like, Shiranui just scales way better in the late game than this deck. This deck can't keep up with it. Res Isle can just outgrind it most effectively, and then stuff like Varga is just more aggressive than this deck can kind of keep up with. Like, it just doesn't, it draws a good amount, but it just doesn't quite draw enough, or at least consistently enough, to survive high pressure turns, and its aggression early game is definitely a lot less, and then it just doesn't scale as well into the late game as some of those other decks. So ultimately, this is just a really fun deck. I think if you do want to play it, it can be a blast for locals, but definitely don't be looking to try to bring this to any competitive tournament and really turn out any results. But now I want to hear from you all. What have you been kind of running in your Magnolia Elder deck, and why? That specifically differs from my list. I love to hear what your all's thoughts to help improve all of our decks collectively. And if you've enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell so you're notified when I do upload more content. But with that being said though, look forward to more content coming out real soon.